In this next unit, we're going to talk about lifespan development. Lifespan development is how you age across your life. That's not just aging in a negative way. That includes processes of change, both as you develop and as you continue to change until the end of your life. We're going to start by talking about child development, then we'll move on and talk a little bit about adolescent development in another lecture, and then finally aging and processes of aging. So today we're going to talk about the stage theories of development. We're going to talk about sensitive periods. And lastly, I'm going to give you some examples of common theories in human development. One of the things that we easily recognize is how much change happens in the first 5 to 10 years of a child's life. So here you can see pictures of my children on various ages. See if you can guess actually what ages they were. Let's see how good you are. And you can see, right, there is some dramatic change that happens from when they're an infant until they are older, right? In face structure, in behavior, everything about them starts to change. My kids now are 14 and 10, so they've continued to change, and they will continue to change across their lifetime. We often assume, though, because there is so much physical change, so much major physical change that happens in these first few years of life, that's really where most of the important events happen in our life. And not to say that there are not important things that happen, but they actually continue to happen from here until the end of your life. You are constantly changing. Please don't assume that just because there are physical changes that there must be corresponding psychological changes that are in the same degree as you age. Let's take a look at stage theories of development, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about this towards the end. So stage theories of development, and there are many of them, tend to say that you change because of biologically based brain changes. That you reach a certain point in your development, your brain is now able to learn, it's able to change, and because of that maturation of your brain, that starts to happen. It also doesn't account for important gender or cultural differences, so it tends to assume that everyone changes in similar ways across their lifetime, and it tends to ignore individual differences as a way to sort of get a handle on what similarities are there in change. Lastly, stage theories of development historically have tended to focus on early childhood over adolescence and adulthood. For example, Sigmund Freud's major theory about development stopped at age 11, where he believed there weren't significant changes after that, or at least the most important ones were the ones that happened in those first few years of life. Another example of a stage theory of development is Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Piaget was a Swiss psychologist working in the 1940s and 50s, looking at how do children cognitively change, and he suggested that in fact that there were 4 stages children go through: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete, and formal operations. He believed that what triggered children to move from one stage to another was a crisis. So something happens that their current stage can't deal with and can't understand that requires that they move on to a new stage. So in the sensory motor stage, children are really focused on developing reflexes and voluntary motor control. This is what happens from the age of 0 to 2. So Piaget believed that this is really a time when children are just kind of figuring out their perceptual abilities. How do they see what's around them? How do they control their own movements, right? And if you've ever noticed young children, babies at 3 months of age, a lot of their behaviors are pretty simple. They're moving their hand back and forth in circles. They're staring at their hand or trying to put their foot in their mouth. These are the basics of voluntary motor control. But that is allowing them to start to understand what's going on in the world. Like, for example, I can control this item down here at the end of my body, this foot. I can do things with it. The second stage at age 2 till 7 is the pre-operational stage. In this stage, Piaget believed that children now are starting to develop language ability. They can start to label objects, but they're still somewhat egocentric. They're really thinking about the world from their perspective. You can notice this most commonly when you ask a child to play hide and seek who is 3 years old, and they may hide in a very obvious spot, and they just assume that because they can't see you, you can't see them. That's a great example of this egocentric view. They don't understand that you might think something different than they do, that you might see the world from a different perspective physically. So children are really focused on learning how to develop language, how to interact with others, and how they can regulate the world around them. From 7 to 11, children enter concrete operations. This is where they're starting to understand things like time and distance. A 5-year-old in pre-operations can't really understand what a 5-minute timeout means. So you're going to say you're in timeout for 5 minutes. They're going to have no idea. Every 30 seconds, they're going to ask you, is it over yet? Is it over yet? You cannot get frustrated, or you shouldn't get frustrated with them. They don't have a sense of time. They don't have some of those abilities yet. You might try to put a timer in front of them and say, this is your timer, watch it count down. Okay? By 7, they start to gain some of these things. You'll notice that in schools, we start to teach things about telling time and doing mathematical operations. Children start to understand relative size, so they can look in a book and say, with a picture of an ant next to a T-Rex that are the same size, they can sort of make the assumption that, oh, right, I've read somewhere that T-Rexes are bigger, so this picture isn't accurate. By age 11, Piaget suggested children start to enter formal operations, where they're now able to make deductions, they can draw conclusions based off of data, and they can even think into the future about what the world might be like if something was different, right? Abstract reasoning. So those 4 abilities were the foundation of Piaget's theory. Now, in general, a good deal of evidence did originally support his stages. And the stages are generally right, the ages might be off. So here's the original data, some of the original data from 1976. You can see in orange, these are children who are in pre-operations. You can see at age 5, most of them are still in pre-operations. Remember, this is from 2 to 7. By 7 years of age, you can see only about 30% here are left in pre-operations. Most have started to move into concrete operations. Remember, concrete operations goes from 7 to 11. And you can see we're getting more and more kids. They're here. Both the red and the blue are concrete operations. Most of them are still, even through age 12, are still in concrete operations. You start to get a few people who are in the onset stage of formal operations, but even by 13 and 14, very few are actually in mature formal operations. So this is something slightly different. Kellogg, Renner, Stafford, Lawson, McKinnon, Friet, and Kellogg found, in fact, that unlike Piaget's original theory, they were not finding that as many were in formal operations by the age of 11. But in general, the pattern of change seems to be somewhat similar. There's a video in the additional resources by Alison Gopnik that talks more about actually more current data and how, in fact, children are able to do some of these abilities far earlier than even some of this Renner data suggested. Even before the age of 5, they're doing some of these complex abilities. The second thing I said we were going to talk about is sensitive periods. Sensitive periods is a time in your life when it's easier to learn or be affected, or you're more vulnerable to something, right? And in fact, many of us believe that childhood is this critical part of life when it's easier to learn things, we're more vulnerable to being exposed to chemicals in the environment or emotional trauma, whatever it might be. And in fact, yes, there are times when we are more sensitive to some of these things. Early in development, as you're a fetus, there are times when you're developing limbs that you might be vulnerable to certain kinds of toxins in the environment. We know that fetuses or young babies who are exposed to lead, there is some damage, as you may remember from one of the earlier lectures, there is some damage to their brain that causes lower IQ. Again, the correlation is pretty low, but there is some of that. There is some sensitive period. But, you know, a good example of this idea that really sort of ran rampant was the idea that babies who are born under the influence of crack are doomed, that it's going to be a terrible life, they're going to be addicted to drugs, their brain is going to be malformed, and they're not going to be able to recover. Lyons and Rittner actually looked at some of the original babies who were born under the influence of crack. So these were 6 to 8-year-old children. They actually found that most of these children were not different than their same-aged peers. So of course, lots of babies born under the influence of crack are living in low income environments. They're maybe living in poverty. They are in those associated school districts and neighborhoods, and their parents did not get early prenatal care, or their parent did not get early prenatal care. So they attributed actually that in fact these babies were no different than their same age peers who grew up in the same neighborhood. That in fact living in a low income environment and living in poverty was actually more damaging for these children long term than it was to be born under the influence of crack. Now, that's not to say that there's not any effect, but in fact, the effect of not getting prenatal care and not having good nutrition when you were young was more important than the influence of crack cocaine. Another example of this where we think that in fact there may be long-term sensitive periods comes when we learn languages. So Asubel in 1964 did a study to test the idea of whether or not you can learn a new language when you're younger. Does that actually make it easier? An idea that most of us hold to be true. And in fact, Asubel wanted to test it. And I'll remind you that this was 50 years ago that he tested this idea. He tested 5-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 25-year-olds. They were each given a made-up language, so a brand new language none of them had any experience with. They're commonly done in studies of linguistics to see about language learning and other language processes. So they had 8 weeks to learn the language. They were tested at the end of the 8 weeks. Asubel found that, in fact, the 5-year-olds, the 15-year-olds, and 25-year-olds were almost indistinguishable on their ability to learn that brand new, made-up language. That suggests, in fact, that there may not be the sensitive period. Now, of course, this data by itself doesn't tell us that, but it suggests that maybe it's not that our brain is easier to learn when we're young. Maybe the reason it seems like it's easier to learn a language when you're younger is because maybe 5-year-olds take more risks. 5-year-olds are willing to practice with a brand new language because they're going to mess it up, but that's okay. They probably mess up in their primary language all the time. I guarantee you that 15-year-olds and 25-year-olds, they have the social pressure of not wanting to seem like they don't know the language, so they don't want to practice it. And I think not practicing it when you're 15 and 25 is actually probably more damaging and probably better explains why it seems harder to learn a new language when you're younger, or harder to learn a new language when you're older. The last thing we're going to talk about is attachment theory. Attachment theory is this idea that mother and child, or caregiver and child, form an emotional bond early in life during those first 0 to 3 years of life. This was originally suggested by Bowlby in 1952. Please note that at the time this idea was revolutionary, that all the theories about why children bond to parents had nothing to do with emotion or care or security, that really the two prevailing theories about why children stay close to mom and dad was from Freud, who thought that infants only stay near mom because they need to satisfy an oral need. They have a sucking reflex. That psychological oral need has to be satisfied by sucking on mom's breasts. And Freud believed that, in fact, if children were not breastfed, that there would be long-term psychological damage. They would be more likely to suffer from addiction or overeating problems. Alternatively, the behaviorists who studied learning and memory, as we'll talk about in a few modules, behaviorists believed that, in fact, infants were really good at staying near mom because that's where food came from. They had just learned, oh, well, mom means food. So as long as I stay near mom, I'm going to get food. And if I move too far away, then I'm not going to get food. Again, no emotion. It was all essentially this very basic either classical conditioning or operant conditioning response or an instinctual oral need that required them to stay close to mom. That infants were essentially parasites feeding off of their parents and didn't actually care about them at all. So Bowlby actually used data from monkeys to start to look at this. So this is data by Harry Harlow. Harry Harlow disproved both of those two, both the Freudian and the behaviorism theories, by testing these baby monkeys. So these were young rhesus monkeys. Sometimes when they came into the lab, they didn't have any mother. Their mother had passed away, or they had been separated from their mom and their mom rejected them. These infants, Harry Harlow noted, had tons of emotional and behavioral problems, so he wanted to see if there was a way to help rehabilitate some of these young animals. So Harry Harlow raised these animals with artificial moms. The one with smaller eyes here, that's kind of hard to see in the graphic, it has a wooden base, it has a wire body, it has a heat lamp, and it has food. So this has milk, okay? So this allows the infants to suckle, which tests Freud's theory, and it also allows them to get food, which tests a behaviorist theory that it's all just about food and warmth. But there was an alternative mom. The alternative mom had a wire body wrapped in terry cloth towel and had a larger face. This one did not have food and did not have heat. And in fact, as you can see in the picture, most of the infant monkeys spent most of their time on the soft terry cloth mom. Harry Harlow believed this is because they were looking for contact comfort. That in fact it had nothing to do with a desire for food or warmth or suckling, that really what they wanted is to be held. That seems obvious nowadays, but in fact in the 1920s to the 1950s, that's not what we believe to be true. In fact, not only did Harry Harlow test these animals just when they're sitting, like how do they spend their day, who do they want to spend more time with, he also actually tested them by putting them in a maze, basically a forced choice maze. So it looks like a letter Y. And the monkey is in the center of that Y. and there's a robot, basically a wooden robot that's pushed towards them that looks kind of scary. And the baby monkey has to choose whether to run to the wire mom or the soft mom. And in more than 90% of the cases, when scared, do the infants run to the soft mom. That, more importantly, tells you that, in fact, infants, when they're afraid, run to the soft mom. They're not looking for food, they're looking for comfort. Mary Ainsworth, pictured here, was a student of Bowlby's who furthered Bowlby's work in humans and looked at basically a standardized laboratory test that you could measure attachment styles. So one of the things that Bowlby noticed was that some kids had secure attachments where they were well structured, they had a normal attachment to their parents, and some infants didn't have, they had an insecure attachment. Mary Ainsworth actually identified, in fact, that these children had more than just these two, secure or insecure, and she developed a task to test this. So what happens generally in the task, it's more complicated than how I'm going to describe, but just for the ease of time, infants are either brought into a room with their mom, where their mom will leave, so they're separated, then with a stranger, the stranger tries to comfort the infant, then eventually the mother will return and also try to comfort the infant. What she identified was 4 patterns of attachment, so that the children differ in the way they respond both to separation and to reunion. So secure infants, which make up about 50% of all infants in the US and in most other countries that we've studied, secure infants tend to be upset when they're separated. That makes sense. They don't want their parent to leave. Infants use crying to get mom and dad to come back. They're separated and upset, but when mom and dad come back, they're happy upon reunion, right? They're like, oh, I missed you, you're back, you responded to my cries. What they've learned from their parents is, when you cry, I will come and get you. I will be there for you. You can depend on me. Avoidant infants, on the other hand, have learned that they're not supposed to express emotion. They're not supposed to get upset. They're not supposed to be happy. They're supposed to keep it all inside. These avoidant infants they're sad, so just because they ignore their parent upon separation, they just don't cry externally. But if you look at their blood pressure, it's sky high. And upon reunion, what you'll see is that they also tend to not be very excited to see mom and dad. You can imagine how heartbreaking that might be for a parent who's dropped off their kid at childcare and comes to get them at the end of the day. But unfortunately, what they've learned from mom and dad is, don't show it. Keep it inside. We don't express our emotions. Third are anxious infants. Anxious infants tend to be extremely upset when they're separated because they've learned from mom and dad that mom and dad are not always available. Mom and dad may work really bad hours. Mom and dad may have a job where they're on call sometimes. Maybe mom and dad travel a lot for work. Or maybe mom and dad are struggling with other kinds of things like depression or anxiety or alcohol abuse. What that means is that those parents do not come and pick up their children. And in fact, I realize that we often tell parents you should make your kid cry it out. The research since the 1960s has told us that that is bad. Dr. Spock is wrong, that in fact Mary Ainsworth and many others have told us through decades and decades of research that when your child cries, you should respond to them. You don't have to pick them up, but you should tell them it's going to be okay. You should check on their needs and help them to learn how to respond appropriately. So again, these anxious infants are highly upset when they're left. And upon reunion, because they've learned that mom and dad is never available, they're angry. They're upset. They're like, why didn't you come back? I may bite you. I may hit you. I may slap you. Lastly, in the 1990s, Mary Ainsworth identified a 4th attachment style called the disorganized attachment style. These are pretty rare. So secure attachments are in about 50% of children. Avoidant and anxious are in about another 25% of children. And 1 to 2%, so there's some, I know it doesn't add up to 100%, but about 1 to 2% are disorganized. So again, it's pretty rare. It tends to fall into 2 kinds of categories. These kids are either really fearful of their parents or they're overly clingy, almost like an anxious child. These tend to be the case where parents are emotionally abusive or physically abusive, so they have some variable response to separation, and they tend to be pretty fearful upon reunion because they don't know if there's going to be some sort of abuse because maybe mom or dad has had a stressful day or has been drinking or something else has happened. These attachment styles have long-term implications for these children's lives. Children who are secure tend to have higher self-esteem, better impulse control in childhood, like at 5, 6, and 7. They also those attachment styles tend to influence their adult relationships. So Chris Fraley and Phil Shaver in 1998 identified, in fact, that when adults with different attachment styles are left at an airport, so their significant other has to get on a plane and travel, secure adults tend to be sad that their partner's leaving, but happy when their partner comes back. Think about an anxious infant. An anxious adult is sad that you're leaving. They don't want you to leave. Please don't go. Please don't go. Please don't go. Please don't leave me. I'm going to miss you so much. And they're angry when you come back because they're going to accuse you of cheating. Who were you with? Why didn't you answer my phone? Because what's happening is they're always worried you're going to leave, because as a child, that's what they worried about. Getting angry with them is not going to make that better, because then they're worried that it's their fault, and then they're worried you're going to leave because now you're mad at them. If you actually are in a relationship with someone with an anxious attachment style, you need to be secure. You need to be calm and reassuring. I'm not going anywhere. I love you. We're going to be okay, right? I realize you have these anxieties. There's nothing to worry about. That will, over time, allow them to change. And in fact, multiple studies have shown that your attachment style is not set in stone. Those monkeys that we were talking about that Harry Harlow worked with were able to be rehabilitated. So when animals were totally separated and didn't have a mom, they actually did have some long-term behavioral effects. But what he showed is that as adults, if you paired them with other regularly reared adult monkeys, they would develop normal or more normal social behaviors. And in humans, for children who are at risk for having insecure attachment styles, either avoidant or anxious styles, their parents are struggling with drug addiction, single parents who are not working, things like that, single visits by social workers. So a social worker comes to the home for 1 hour once a week and works with the parent, helps them work through what are some of the problems they're experiencing, interviews the parent, gives them hints about how to improve their parenting. What you see is that those children who receive those social work visits, when compared to parents who did not receive social work visits, those parents who received those visits, their children had a 10-point higher IQ score, and they were twice as likely to have a secure attachment style. This shows that your attachment style is not set in stone.